discouraged. These things are hard. They always take longer than you'd like. They're always more imperfect than you would hope, but they're worth doing because they're meaningful to people on the ground in setting the foundation for more prosperous, better futures.
Welcome to the Lawyering Peace interview series, where we explore the art of diplomacy and the legal frameworks that underpin peace processes. Join us as we engage with prominent figures who have played pivotal roles as lawyers, negotiators, and diplomats in the quest for peace. I'm your host, Dr. Paul Williams, the founder and president of the Public International Law and Policy Group and the Rebecca Grazier Professor of Law and International Relations at American University. Today, I'm privileged to be joined by Ambassador Keith Harper, a trailblazer in international diplomacy and human rights advocacy. As the first Native American ambassador for the United States, Keith has brought a unique perspective to his role as ambassador to the UN Human Rights Council, where he was instrumental in championing global human rights issues and advancing international standards. His career is marked by a deep commitment to justice and equality, and he has been a prominent voice on various global platforms. We are honored to have him with us today to share his invaluable insights and experiences.
Thank you, Paul.
Let's jump in right off the bat with a question on the relationship between human rights and durable peace. Can you walk us through the interplay between human rights and the prospects for durable peace? And from your experience, how does the promotion and protection of human rights impact the prospects for achieving a long-lasting peace, if at all?
Well, thanks, Paul. It's good to be with you today. I think human rights ultimately is instrumental in ensuring a durable peace and being one of the pillars of a durable peace. I think the best way to think about this is to get back to first principles. The rule-based international order, in my mind, requires that we also have certain rules that states abide by vis-a-vis individuals. And one of those sets of rules is human rights, right? What are the obligations that states possess? And if we look at conflicts, we can see all too often that conflicts are the result of the prior violation of human rights. One group violates the human rights of another group, and it starts an armed conflict of one sort or another. You look at all the conflicts that you and others have dealt with and tried to bring resolution for. I mean, we look right now, if we look at, for example, South Sudan, and why has it not been able to have a durable peace? Well, there is a lot of history there between two groups that have a long history of violating each other's rights. So in my mind, it's sort of a pretty readily ascertainable conclusion that to have a durable peace requires the observance of human rights. Because at the end of the day, what you're trying to do is avoid recurrence. And to avoid recurrence, you have to have some sense that individuals usually from various groups are going to be treated fairly. And then part and parcel is what human rights tries to set forth as the expectations.
Keith, what do you see as some of the main challenges? So you need human rights woven into a peace process, as you mentioned, in South Sudan and other conflicts around the globe, in order to ensure a durable peace. But what have you observed as the challenges of bringing human rights into the peace process, getting the parties to negotiate? And what are some of the ways in which the international community or others have sought to overcome the challenge of weaving human rights into a peace process?
Yeah, to me, the largest challenge is accountability. There's often this tension between ensuring accountability on the one hand and being able to actually get peace on the other, right? Because those you have to persuade to put down their arms are often the same people that one would want to hold accountable. So unless you have sort of total victory of World War II with the Allies and the Nazis, where you can just impose accountability, if you need to negotiate peace, then one of the first things is on the table is what kind of accountability or lack of accountability there will be for the various players. So that's one source of tension, because if you don't have accountability, then those who are wronged in the conflict, because these conflicts invariably have violations of human rights, war crimes and other things. If you don't have accountability for that, then it's hard to see how you move forward. So, I mean, that's the tricky place, is that balance of having some accountability. And of course, we've had some models that have been more successful than others. I think South Africa is often cited, but I don't think that sort of truth approach can fit every place. Truth sometimes in and of itself is not enough. So that, to me, makes it inherently tricky to have human rights. I think what one wants to do in the process is divorce, if you will, accountability for the past, and then what are the rules of observance of human rights going forward. Now, not to not deal with that, but don't let that piece on accountability sort of haunt all future conversations of human rights. First, there's prospective, and there's what do you do retroactively. And to the extent that we can, you're going to have some kind of a calculus in order to both obtain the ceasefire and have some accountability, and that's the tricky part. But that shouldn't overshadow the importance of everybody having rules as to observance of human rights going forward. And so I think a little bit of separation of those two is probably always helpful.
Keith, let's dive into that a little bit more, this peace versus justice, or peace with justice conundrum that the parties face. What are some of the ways to ensure some level of accountability so you don't have non-recurrence? But as you say, if you've got the guys with guns, and if those guys with guns have committed atrocity crimes and you need them to negotiate a ceasefire, a humanitarian corridor, and an end to the conflict, passing out indictments around the table before you sit down to negotiate probably isn't going to encourage them to negotiate. And then these are the folks who will then be negotiating these human rights protections for moving forward. Any thoughts and ideas as to how you modulate just the right amount of accountability in a peace process? I know every situation is difficult, so yeah, it's an unanswerable question, but take a look.
Well, I think it is unanswerable because it is so fact-bound and specific, right? But I can recall some colleagues who were in post-conflict situations in Sierra Leone, for example, and their takeaway was, we'd love accountability, but we really need peace. And so we'll get as much accountability so long as we can first get peace. And maybe other situations are such that you can extract more accountability. It's also who should be held accountable. It's hard to, hold heads of state or heads of government accountable, because they're the ones that are going to make the ultimate decision. But are there specific individuals in the field who were particularly violative of human rights? And can we hold some of them accountable? So I think it's a bit matter of understanding it's a hard choice, first and foremost. It's not sugarcoated. There's some of these things in international affairs that are just hard choices. You want to get the peace and you want to get accountability in a perfect world, and you somehow have to balance those. I think the main message, if you look around, is to say, how much accountability can the particular piece bear? That's the question, right? In different circumstances, you're going to have different answers to that question. In some cases, any kind of accountability will just not have the players at the table, any kind of real accountability. In others, you might be able to have processes that hold some account. It is going to be the rare instance, again, I think only in where you have total victory kind of situation where you're going to have complete accountability, or as complete as possible.
Keith, I really like that, because we tend to, in my universe, talk about, peace with justice, peace versus justice. And essentially you're saying the balance between peace and justice is what has to be figured out for each peace process. I think that's very insightful in terms of helping the parties think through, right, how do we end the conflict? How do we get on a path to durable peace? And what size should the dollop of accountability be in order to move that along the process?
Yeah, exactly. And I think, for example, for those seeking accountability in these processes, I think it's important for them to identify half loaves. Where can you ask for something that's actually politically deliverable by the other side? If you just say, we want complete accountability, that the likelihood of you reaching some kind of peaceful resolution is slight to none. But if you say, okay, what we think needs to happen is that these individuals, for example, who did these particular things or led these particular massacres, or whatever the case might be, we need to have accountability there. And remember, there's been enough studies on this to show that even if you have imperfect accountability, that is helpful for the observance of human rights on a going forward basis. The accountability does not need to be perfect. If those who are, engaged in human rights violations or war crimes understand that there is a possibility that they may be held accountable, then the likelihood that they avoid those things is increased. And that's how these systems should work. I think in all human rights promotion, the one thing I've kind of learned over the years is as my hair has gotten grayer, I have seen the grays more in the world, and appreciated the grays, and appreciated that in human rights promotion, you are rarely going to have some kind of perfect resolution. It's going to be the best you can get. And that's really where these systems are intended to strive for.
So a practical approach to victim catharsis, deterrence, historical record, but you're seldom going to be able to get an all-in approach. And so being the most thoughtful about, okay, if we're going to get half a loaf, which half do we want in order to promote the durable peace? Well, Keith, let's pivot a little bit to your time on the UN Human Rights Council. And if you could share with our listeners a little bit about what you saw in terms of the Human Rights Council's ability to inject human rights or a basis for accountability into a peace process, and what type of impact did the Human Rights Council have on influencing these peace processes and guiding them towards a durable peace based on human rights?
The way I look at the council is that it is a tool in the tool shed of promoting human rights, and that it alone, it would not be a particularly effective tool. But in combination with bilateral relationships, with actions that are taken in, for example, the Security Council or the General Assembly, other things like regional sanctions or bilateral sanctions, right? These are all the tools to persuade countries to do the right thing, right? And I think what the council can do is a couple of things. One, it can do reports, and that sounds kind of like academic, but the fact is that in much of the world, a report with the imprimatur of the UN on the title of it by a group of experts in human rights law that make certain findings is a very persuasive tool. And so the first thing that we do at the HRC is we document the violations. I mean, if you're going to go into a peace process and have this understanding of, we want to have some accountability. So, and we can have not complete accountability, but significant accountability. Well, who should be held accountable? How do you pick and choose? Well, one of the ways to do that is to have findings by credible sources. And these reports can be highly credible. They are dependent. Not all of them are highly credible. But if you look at the Kirby Commission report, for example, on North Korea, there is no doubt that fundamentally changed the conversation regarding human rights in North Korea. I mean, North Korea is still abysmal human rights, but how the world talks about North Korean human rights is different because the Human Rights Council established a commission of inquiry. They did an incredibly persuasive, well-documented report on North Korea, and that fundamentally changed that conversation. I think another example to look at is some of the work that was done with Sri Lanka after the LTTE conflict, which was the end of that conflict was grotesque human rights violations, and that's scorched earth on the Tamil communities in Sri Lanka, and no accountability there. Well, the Human Rights Council passed a series of resolutions, and this actually had a domestic change in Sri Lanka with President Sirisena winning the election, running on a platform of not wanting to be alienated from the international community based on the reports coming out of the HRC. And that's how he defeated, it was one of the key things he ran on to defeat Mahinda Rajapaksa. So it can have domestic impact depending on the country as well. Afterwards, we were able to negotiate a resolution with Sri Lanka, very heavily negotiated resolution that ultimately the Sirisena government backed and the Tamil diaspora backed, which you would thought would not be possible, but they both backed it because it called for a court accountability mechanisms with international elements, I think the term was. And so this is one of those places where everybody gave a little bit and we were able to get enough. Unfortunately, after that, and this is part of the challenge when you're dealing with an entity like the HRC, if you lose steam on something because of political changes on key countries, in our case, the United States, stepping back from the council, then that process did not continue to conclusion. We often talk about this in terms of bringing peace, but I think it's also important to, in a situation where we're continuing peace or maintaining peace. And in the case of Burundi, for example, there's no doubt in my mind that when Nkurunziza held on for another term and was backed by these handpicked Supreme Court, and there were killings of the streets, that the attention brought by the special session at the HRC, and then that translated into actions in other multilateral bodies, was really important to sending the signals that we're watching you, and it really never spiraled out of control as we thought it could. So it's hard to prove the negative here, but I think on all of these fronts, the HRC can play a role in both documenting where atrocities have been done, performed, and identifying the individuals, but also putting pressure so that people want to find their way to the negotiating table.
Well, Keith, let's dive into the commissions of inquiry a little bit. And if you could help provide some additional context and depth for our listeners. Whenever I think of commissions of inquiry, I think of two dimensions. I think there's been almost 36, if I'm not incorrect, commissions of inquiry on specific conflicts. In my first exposure to a commission of inquiry was back when I was at the State Department in the early 90s in the legal office. And there was talk about a tribunal for Yugoslavia, and the Americans and others pitched it to the Human Rights Council, commission of inquiry, and then appointed Sharif Bassioni as the head of the commission. He did an amazingly detailed, fast-paced job, and then recommended the creation of a tribunal, and poof, all of a sudden, not magically, but pretty darn quickly, we had an international criminal tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. And it's like, whoa, Human Rights Council on steroids.
Yeah.
And that hasn't happened with every commission of inquiry, and some of them have kind of petered out. But if you could talk a little bit about, provide some more depth and context to these commissions of inquiry, because they're a little bit of an unseen role that happens before you see a tribunal or before you see a truth commission.
Sure. Yeah. And, the record is mixed, right? I mean, I think that's an example that you just talked about in Yugoslavia that was as credible as one might ever hope, as positive a set of developments as one could ever hope. And you never know on the near side where it's going to lead, right? So you're basically saying, look, we're going to establish these things where we have the most significant situation. So one thing commissions of inquiries do is they send out a signal to the world that this is a situation that is worse than other situations, right? That we're paying particular attention here. I think it's also valuable that that they're made up of, a number of experts, 3 up to 5 in some circumstances, because I think that they're from diverse places in the world. And for them to come to agreement on something will take a little negotiation. And that's good because that gives greater credibility to the ultimate outcome. And then these commissions, when they're done right, Kirby Commission being certainly one of them that we already talked about, but there's been others. I think Myanmar was quite good and quite well done. They then they document the wrongdoing in a way that is persuasive and can lead to both things like tribunals or even set the foundation for prosecution in the ICC, although that has happened less often than one would hope. I think where they have challenges are places like Syria, where, Syria has really powerful countries backing Syria. It's seen as a proxy war in some ways. And when you have those kinds of really tough geopolitical realities, it's hard to see that now we didn't know that on the front side. When we were passing resolutions in 2014, continuing the commission of inquiry, the hope was that things would go differently and that at some point, Assad and others, there would be some accountability, and sometimes that just doesn't become the reality. So I think they're a very powerful tool. I mean, I think the interesting thing is they're so powerful that we've had to negotiate away from using the term commission of inquiry in some instances. And that's why I can't remember the name of the commission in South Sudan, but I think it was the Commission on Human Rights or something, the International Commission on Human Rights, something, because they did not want to be called a COI. And given the dynamics in the African group, we had to negotiate the title. But these things can be super important. I think, though, we also have to recognize that making sure that you have the right people on these commissions is hugely important. If you look, for example, at the one in Eritrea, it really didn't have the impact that one would hope it would have in a country that has such a massively challenged human rights situation.
Well, Keith, let me pick up on Syria and Myanmar, because those were 2 instances, and maybe to get you to give us some more depth and context on the independent, impartial monitoring mechanisms that were created as a result of the commissions of inquiry. So, both in Syria, as they were moving in the direction of a tribunal, it didn't really happen. Same with the independent, impartial mechanism for Myanmar, but they got very clever and they pivoted from the commission of inquiry, transitioned its mandate, or the council and the General Assembly created these 2 independent mechanisms to basically continue to gather documentation, but specifically for the purposes of accountability and prosecution. As you mentioned, the commission of inquiry does the report, puts it out there. These 2 follow-on mechanisms are busy assembling data that can be used for universal jurisdiction cases, or for the International Criminal Court. That's when it happened. Sort of team accountability, which I'm a part of, was like, oh, come on, seriously? We want to go for accountability. This is just an off-ramp. But team reality it's actually been pretty impactful what these 2 mechanisms have done. Can you share with us a little bit more about your perspective on those mechanisms?
I think it was a very innovative and smart idea because, one of the challenges, let's take Syria, for example. One of the challenges with Syria is that commission of inquiry had gone on for so long that it really wasn't having any political impact in the real world. When it first got established, it was hugely politically impactful. But over time, it's just sort of like you're renewing the mandate, the reports are more atrocities, it's not meaningful in any way. And so pivoting kind of changes that dynamic, does something new. And I think that the question that we should be asking, and this is true for any multilateral institution, any multilateral system, what have you. If we shouldn't have done this, then what should we have done? That's the question. It's not, does what we do have maximum efficacy? That's not the question. The question is, what are the alternatives, and is this the best way to approach it? Recognizing that, look, this takes meaningful resources from other things. So it's zero sum in some sense. But it seems to me that, particularly in Myanmar and Syria, the world should continue to say these are outlier situations where there has been and continues to be grotesque human rights violations in a scale that is simply different from other countries. And I think it's also helpful when some countries are thinking about rapprochement with, say, Syria, that we still send the signals that no, this regime is the murderous regime that killed literally hundreds of thousands of people and massively violated human rights on a grand scale. So I think it has a multiplicity of benefits to continue. And I think sort of renewing it in the way that it has into this new entity, helps it focus on what it should be focused on, which is we still hope down the road something changes and we can have accountability, and then we will have the documentation to support.
Let me pivot to the future. You talked early on in this podcast episode about, dealing with accountability for the past, teeing up success for the future in peace processes and human rights. Big picture future, as we move forward, many of our listeners for the podcast are dynamic young professionals who are beginning their career in peace negotiations, human rights, transitional justice. Others are mid-career and thinking about the next 25, 30 years of their career. What do you recommend? What do you suggest for moving forward to more successfully entwine human rights protections into peace processes in order to enhance the prospects for durable peace agreements?
Well, I think it's a great question, a very complicated question. I say that one thing is we just have to make sure that they're part of the topics of conversation early on in the process. And I think that human rights are too often an afterthought. And that's because negotiators want to focus on the here and now. But I think it's short-sighted. And I think that part of what we're talking about is that it's short-sighted because if you want the durability of the peace, there's no benefit. Well, there's some benefit, but there's little benefit in having something that stops for a few years and then just restarts again, right? I mean, we don't want Sudan, right? Sudan was great for a few years, but it's not great anymore. We don't want that. That's not the kind of thing. We don't want South Sudan to, they have a ceasefire for 6 months and then break out again. We don't want Myanmar to take a turn towards democratic rule and then reverse course. What we want is the durability, and that durability, as we talked about earlier, I think the record indicates, this is not surmise, the record indicates that human rights as part of that conversation is incredibly important for the durability. So I think the first lesson is, let's not have it be an afterthought. Let's have it be a core part of does that make things more complicated? Yes, it's going to make things more complicated. You're going to deal with this issue of accountability versus peace kind of situation. What is the right calculus in the particular circumstance? It's going to make it more complicated, but these are complicated anyways. And there's a lot of complications. And I think that the ones that you see are sustainable are the ones that ensure they have some serious understandings that emerge from the peace process about how individuals are going to be treated in the future by the state and by the key players.
There's no shortcut to peace. If you look at the Colombian peace process, it's hundreds of pages long, took years to negotiate, and it seems beholding. And they've woven human rights fairly effectively into it.
And it wasn't particularly popular. It got voted down the first time. So,
accountability.
Yeah, because of the accountability issue, right? So, as imperfect as it was, I think Colombia and the average Colombian is doing much better today than they were prior to the peace process.
And it's the heavy lifting of not just, there's no shortcuts to getting to yes or no shortcuts to building a durable peace.
That's right.
Keith, you've been so generous with your time. Let me ask you one last question. And this is the key takeaway. What is it that you want our listeners to remember tomorrow, next year, 5 years from now, from having listened to this podcast? What's the one thing that you want to put into their long-term memory as they go forth and seek to build durable peace agreements?
Don't be discouraged. These things are hard. They always take longer than you'd like. They're always more imperfect than you would hope, but they're worth doing because they're meaningful to people on the ground in setting the foundation for more prosperous, better futures. So I say Godspeed because, this is critically important work and it is going to make a difference in a lot of places. But understanding that human rights in particular have to be part of that conversation is critical to getting it right.
Well, Keith, I think I'm gonna pull that soundbite from this podcast and send it to my students this afternoon. Since when I do my negotiation simulations in class, I think I leave them all slightly encouraged about how's this ever going to work? But as someone like yourself who's dedicated their career to human rights, making the world a better place, making the United States a better place, it's really impactful to hear those words from you because you get up every day, and even if it's your pro bono work, in your case, in practice, if it's your work on the UN Human Rights Council, on the Native American Commission, the Indigenous Rights Committee for the UN, you're always in the fight. You're always in the mix. And so it's been a real honor and privilege for me to have you share your time and your thoughts and your insights today. And we've been friends for nearly a decade now, I think. And so I really enjoyed that friendship and to learn from you in the way that our listeners have been able to learn from you over these last 45 minutes. So.
No, thanks, Paul, for having me. It's been a great conversation. And keep up the good work. You get those students through it. Settle. We need more peace in the world. That's for sure.
Well, they're inspired by individuals like you, Keith, who've been trailblazers in this area for them. So thank you.
Thanks for having me.